Brisket comes from the lower chest. It is part of a muscle group that supports a large portion of the cow's body weight during standing and movement. That constant load creates dense muscle fibers held together by thick bands of collagen-rich connective tissue. Unlike steak cuts, that structure doesn't soften under short bursts of heat, and it requires prolonged exposure to low temperatures. Over several hours of slow cooking, the connective tissue gradually begins to dissolve into gelatin, while internal fat slowly renders through the surrounding muscle. As that process continues, the once firm structure starts to loosen from within. By the end of the cook, the muscle fibers separate easily while still retaining enough moisture to remain tender when sliced. Pork shoulder. Taken from the upper front leg, pork shoulder comes from a heavily used muscle involved in movement and support. That repeated use results in a dense network of connective tissue running between the muscle fibers, along with fat distributed throughout the meat. When exposed to low, sustained heat, the collagen within those tissues slowly begins to convert into gelatin. At the same time, the internal fat melts and moves through the structure as it cooks. Over time, those changes cause the muscle to relax and separate into individual strands. This is what allows the meat to be pulled apart without losing the moisture trapped inside the fibers. Pork belly is taken from the underside of the pig. It contains far more fat than most traditional barbecue cuts, with layers of muscle running between thick bands of soft tissue. It does not rely as heavily on connective breakdown as something like shoulder or brisket. During a long cook, the fat gradually begins to render while the surrounding meat firms up just enough to hold together. As that process continues, the internal layers loosen slightly without fully separating. When sliced, the texture feels soft and rich rather than fibrous. Smoked sausage is often made from ground pork or beef mixed with fat and seasoning. Because the meat is ground and the muscle structure is already disrupted, sausage behaves differently from whole muscle cuts. As heat moves through the casing, the fat inside begins to melt while the proteins firm up enough to hold everything together. The interior stays cohesive rather than shredding apart. When sliced, it feels springy instead of crumbly. Smoked turkey breast. Cut from a muscle that isn't used heavily for sustained movement, turkey breast contains very little internal fat. During long exposure to heat, the fibers begin to tighten sooner than they would in darker meat. Without careful timing, moisture can be pushed out as the structure firms up. When cooked properly, the meat remains sliceable without turning dry. The texture feels smooth rather than fibrous. Pork spare ribs. Pork ribs come from along the rib cage, where thin layers of muscle sit between bone and connective tissue. Compared to larger barbecue cuts, the meat itself doesn't need to break down as deeply, but the structure still benefits from extended exposure to low heat. Over time, the collagen surrounding the rib bones begins to soften, while fat gradually renders through the meat. The finished texture tends to hold together rather than fall apart completely, allowing a clean bite without pulling the entire rack loose. Different styles like spare ribs, baby backs, and St. Louis cut ribs vary in fat content and cooking time, though they follow the same general process during a long smoke. Beef plate ribs. Cut from the lower rib section, these surround muscles that help stabilize the cow's torso. The fibers are reinforced with connective tissue that responds best to prolonged heat, rather than quick searing. Over time, that internal structure gradually loosens while the fat softens and moves through the meat. The result is a thick section that slices cleanly, but does not feel firm when chewed. Each bite tends to separate into soft layers instead of breaking apart all at once. Smoked duck. Unlike most barbecue cuts, duck carries a thick layer of fat just beneath the skin, rather than throughout the muscle itself. As the cook progresses, that surface fat begins to render slowly, while the underlying meat remains intact. The muscle fibers firm slightly instead of breaking down. Over time, the skin tightens as more of the fat melts away. When sliced, the interior stays cohesive rather than shredding. Tri-tip. Cut from the bottom sirloin of the cow, this muscle doesn't carry as much connective tissue as traditional barbecue cuts. It still benefits from slower cooking, though it behaves more like a roast than a shreddable cut. As heat moves inward, the fat cap begins to soften along the surface. The interior stays firm enough to slice thinly across the grain. When served that way, the bite feels tender without falling apart. Burnt ends. Typically made from the point end of a brisket, this section contains more internal fat than the leaner flat. During extended cooking, the marbling softens along with the connective tissue that holds the muscle together. When the meat is cubed and returned to the smoker, the surface continues to dry slightly, while the interior remains soft. That contrast creates a firmer exterior around a tender center. The final pieces hold their shape, but feel rich when bitten into. Beef chuck roast, cut from the shoulder, comes from a heavily used area made up of several overlapping muscle groups. Its internal structure contains multiple seams of connective tissue that respond slowly to steady heat. Over time, those seams begin to relax as the fat within the roast softens and moves through the surrounding fibers. The meat tends to break into larger chunks rather than thin strands once it is fully cooked. When handled properly, it can be pulled apart but still feels substantial when bitten into. Beef chuck short ribs come from the shoulder area rather than the plate. They contain dense muscle fibers supported by connective tissue that benefits from extended cooking. As heat moves through the meat, collagen begins to soften gradually while fat renders between the muscle layers. The structure slowly relaxes without completely losing its shape. When done, the meat can be sliced or pulled into thick sections. The bite usually separates into soft layers instead of shredding into strands. Smoked whole chicken. Unlike single muscle cuts, a whole bird contains both white and dark meat that react differently during long exposure to heat. The breast comes from a less active area and firms up fairly quickly, while the thighs and legs soften over time because they have more fat and connective tissue. As the cook continues, the darker meat begins to loosen while the breast remains sliceable. The skin slowly renders along the surface. When finished, the texture varies across the bird depending on which part you're eating. Pork loin. Cut from the back of the pig, this is a leaner muscle that is not supported by large amounts of internal fat or connective tissue. During slow cooking, the fibers tend to firm up more quickly than they would in fattier cuts. With extended heat, moisture can begin to move out of the structure before anything breaks down internally. Timing plays a larger role here than it does with shoulder or ribs. When handled carefully, the meat remains sliceable without turning dry. Prime rib is cut from the rib section of the cow. This muscle does less work during the animal's life, and it contains less connective tissue than traditional barbecue cuts. The structure does not rely on breakdown to become tender. As heat moves inward, the fat within the meat softens while the muscle fibers remain largely intact. Instead of separating into strands, the roast holds together as it cooks. When carved across the grain, the slices feel tender without falling apart. Pork jowl is cut from the cheek area. It contains a high concentration of fat and relatively little dense muscle tissue. During long exposure to heat, that fat begins to render gradually, while the surrounding meat firms up slightly. The internal structure changes without loosening into strands. As more fat melts, the texture becomes softer without becoming fragile. When sliced, the meat feels rich rather than fibrous. Lamb shoulder comes from the front leg. It is part of a muscle group that is used constantly for movement and support. The internal structure contains connective tissue running between several overlapping muscle sections and fat distributed throughout the meat. During slow cooking, those seams begin to soften, as the fat gradually melts into the surrounding fibers. As time passes, the muscle loosens without losing its shape entirely. When finished, the meat can be pulled into soft chunks that still feel substantial when bitten into. Pulled pork. Usually made from pork shoulder, this cut contains several overlapping muscle groups that were built for movement. The structure is reinforced with connective tissue and streaks of fat running between the fibers. During low, steady cooking, those seams begin to soften while the internal fat slowly melts into the surrounding meat. As the hours pass, the once solid roast starts to loosen and separate into strands. By the time it's finished, the meat can be pulled apart without feeling dry or stringy. From brisket to ribs, BBQ is all about time and heat. Let us know in the comments what we should cover next. Thanks for watching.